The third lesson of the week will survey how the European nations carried out the conquest and subjugation of the peoples of the Americas. An important book by historian Jared Diamond titled Guns, Germs, and Steel posits the theory that European and North African civilizations merely had the good luck of geography as well as power and technology gaps to conquer these people rather than having some sort of an intellectual, moral, or inherent genetic superiority. So we're going to see the work of the Spanish in conquest, the surge of Spain to the forefront of the colonial period, and their apostles of empire, the conquistadores, the conquerors. You notice the image. In the Aztec cosmology, the human heart was the ultimate source of life and bridge between humanity and the gods. They practiced ritual human sacrifice in which they carved out beating hearts with obsidian knives and offered them up to deities like Huitzilopochtli to nourish the sun and sustain the universe. Although the devotion of Catholics to the Sacred Heart of Christ did not originate until 1672, Spanish missionaries like the Franciscans and Dominicans utilized the profound spiritual importance the Aztecs already placed on the heart. They taught that God did not require human bloodshed, but rather that Christ had offered his own heart and life-giving blood for humanity. Thus, when an indigenous peasant named Juan Diego saw an apparition of the Blessed Virgin in 1531 at Tepeyac Hill in the village of Guadalupe near modern-day Mexico, he would see it with the imagery of the heart, and the heart would continue to be woven closely into the Mexican cosmology and the understanding of Christ. The Portuguese could not maintain their lead in the imperial race because they were too small a nation, whereas its neighbor Spain was a rising power. With the establishment of the Spanish Empire by Columbus and later Ponce de Leon and Cortez, the problem arose regarding what to do about the native populations the Spanish were subjugating. Thus, the Spanish, spurred by the former colonist turned Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas, convened in 1550 what was known as La Junta de Valladolid, that is, the first public debate in European history to discuss the morality, rights, and treatment of indigenous people by European colonizers. It was held in the Colegio de San Gregorio in the Spanish city of Valladolid. It debated the moral legitimacy of the conquest of the Americas, its justification for the conversion to Catholicism, and more specifically about the relations between the European settlers and the natives of the New World. It consisted of a number of opposing views about the way natives were to be integrated into Spanish society, their conversion to Catholicism, and their rights. And the question was simple: are the native populations fully and truly human? Now, de las Casas, who was the foremost defender of the Amerindians, argued that native inhabitants were free men in the natural order, despite their practice of human sacrifices and other such customs, and deserved the same consideration as the colonizers. Now, opposing this view were several scholars and priests, including a humanist by the name of Juan Inés de Sepulveda. And he argued that the human sacrifice of innocents, cannibalism, and other such crimes against nature were simply unacceptable and should be suppressed by any means possible, including war. At the end, both sides claimed to have won the debate, but de las Casas initiated legislation protecting the natives from the extremes of forced labor, but they didn't get rid of forced labor completely. Now, eventually, the Spanish Empire in America and the Portuguese Empire in Brazil ran up against each other. And the Portuguese claimed that all the land south of the Canary Islands belonged to them by edict of the Pope. As a result, the two nations submitted the dispute to the Vatican, and there Pope Alexander VI, a member of the Borgia family, which meant that he was ethnically Spanish, drew a line, a meridian from pole to pole, that kept the Portuguese almost completely out of the Americas. So then the two powers, both dissatisfied one way or another, circumvented the Pope and worked out a treaty on their own in the town of Tordesillas on June the 7th, 1494. And here they established a dividing meridian to the west of where Alexander had drawn his meridian. So that meant that the Portuguese would have Brazil, which is one of the reasons why Brazilians are the only South American country that speaks Portuguese. It sets the boundary between the Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Why is this significant? It shows how the European rulers, and the Pope as well, basically divided the globe without any forethought to the peoples who already lived there. So this map shows where Pope Alexander VI drew the line at 38 degrees west in 1493, and then the Treaty of Tordesillas moved it to 46 degrees 37 minutes west, and this allows the Portuguese to have a foothold in Brazil. Now, this line is not, shall we say, a solid line, a hard border, so to speak. Both Spanish and Portuguese crossed over the line, but the Portuguese eventually established themselves very strongly in Brazil. And of course, to your right, you see the draft, the text of the Treaty of Tordesillas. With the spheres of influence settled, this led the Spanish section of the empire open to the conquerors known as conquistadores. We can go back to our sixth grade social studies textbooks to know these names. Hernan Cortez, who conquered the Aztecs and their chief Moctezuma in 1522. You might recall, though, that Cortez was originally thrown out of Tenochtitlan and probably would have been put under an obsidian knife and had his heart carved out, except he had left behind the one thing he needed for his success: the disease of smallpox that brought down almost the entire Aztec nation, including Montezuma. Juan de Ponce de Leon, who explored Florida in 1525, established the town of St. Augustine, not far from Jacksonville, which is the oldest settlement in North America. One of de Leon's settlers, Cabeza de Vaca, was captured on an expedition in Florida. He escaped and walked all the way to Mexico. And along the way, he told tales of cities glittering with gold. And this is, of course, where the famous legend of El Dorado goes. He was probably being told about the pueblos that reflected the sunlight with their yellow sand and mud brick that made it look gold. But this, of course, created gold fever. And Francisco Coronado then explores the American Southwest, becomes the first European to look upon the majesty of the Grand Canyon. Hernando de Soto is the first European to see the Mississippi. And in fact, he is buried in the Mississippi in secret because he had promoted himself as a god to the native tribes. And if they had found out that he had actually died, then, well, the whole expedition probably would have been slaughtered. Down in Peru went Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incas and their chief Atahualpa. At one point, he had the Incas fill essentially a UNO-sized classroom from wall to wall, ceiling to ceiling with gold, and he brought home more gold than all the other combined expeditions. And this gold now proceeds to fill the treasuries of the Spanish. This is, of course, the beginning of the Spanish Main, that is the main path of the Spanish gold ships through the Caribbean and back to Spain. In the lower right image is Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow shipwreck survivors. In 1528, a hurricane destroyed a fleet transporting over 300 Spanish soldiers from Florida to Cuba. He was shipwrecked on the Florida coast. The survivors set out over land for Spain's holding in Mexico. 8 years later, Cabeza de Vaca and 3 other companions were the only ones to survive and stumbled into a Spanish outpost at Culiacan. In the upper left, you see the Aztec human sacrifice ceremony in which the living beating heart is carved out of the, shall we say, willing victim. This map here shows the expedition of Francisco Coronado, who goes all the way into the southwest of the United States and then goes to the Great Plains of North America and probably made it all the way into Kansas. Along the way, he did not find any cities glittering with gold, but he found an immensely rich land, very diverse, with many different tribes of natives living there. Here one sees a map of the world showing the expeditions of the marineros, that is the ship captains, and the conquistadores like Cortez and others. Notice Magellan is the first one to have an expedition that circumnavigates the globe. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines. He came back from a 10-ship expedition with only one ship, but that one ship was laden with enough pepper and nutmeg and paprika to pay for the entire voyage 3 times over. We conclude with a look at North America of the various native tribes that existed there. These are not savage people. They may have had different customs, they may have had different gods, but they were very civilized, very settled people. And this is a map showing them before the conquest. So this was not where Europeans came into some empty land and then these Indians came interloping in later. No, they were already there, they were already established. And through the combination of better weapons and viruses, essentially diseases, Europeans were able to conquer these people that had thickly settled both North and South America.